Today I'm going to be showing you how you can change a bodice that has a waist dart into a bodice that has a princess seam. Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Carmen and I am just someone who loves to sew her own clothes and loves to show you how to do it too. So in today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to change a bodice pattern that has a waist dart into one that has a princess seam. So I was making this pattern. This is Bodice B5647, and I'm going to be making view C for my mom, which is a vest with a rounded collar, and the pattern has waist darts, but we wanted the vest to actually have a princess seam instead of the darts because we wanted to use two different fabrics on the front so that we could have a different fabric along the outside versus the inside of the front of the vest. So I went ahead and changed the waist darted bodice for this vest into a princess seam. So I'm going to show you how I did that with this pattern today. So let's get started. Okay, so all I'm going to be working with is the front piece of my vest pattern. So you can see it has a really big waist dart. So basically all I need to do is connect that dart with a nice curve into the armhole seam. So what I'm going to do is try to connect the outer side of the dart, the side of the dart that's closer to the armhole, and connect that into the armhole with a nice curve. And it's totally up to you how high you want your curve to be, or how curved, if you want it to be more of a shallow curve. You can decide how you want your princess seam curve to look. So I would definitely recommend looking at photos and getting an idea of what kind of curve you want, because I ended up changing mine later because I made it a little bit more angled than I wanted, and it was a little bit too low in the armhole, but it's totally up to you. So once I have my curve drawn in, I'm just going to cut along this line. This will create my two front pieces that once we cut it out of the fabric, we'll be able to sew back together and we'll have that nice princess seam. So once we have the two pieces cut apart, we just need to add in seam allowance to the new part of the seam that we just added. So that's the upper part. And I just realized now that I actually added seam allowance along the entire curve, even though I did not need to actually add seam allowance to the area where the dart already had seam allowance, but it worked out okay. So if you were doing this, then I would only add seam allowance to the upper part above the dart and then blend it into the seam allowance at the dart. That would probably work better, but mine worked out all right the way that I did it. So I ended up adding 5/8 inch seam allowance along that whole curve on both of my pattern pieces. So I used my clear ruler to add in seam allowance on this new piece of pattern paper, and then I used my curved ruler to make the curves evened out and nice, and then I just cut it out. Alright, so that's really all you need to do to add a princess seam to a pattern with a waist dart. And you may be happy with your first iteration of the pattern, and that would be great. But for me, I did a test run of my pattern with some muslin fabric, and then I tried it on my mom, and that's what we have here. when I tried it on her, we marked some changes. So you can see on the right hand side that I had marked where I actually wanted the curve to go. So I wanted it to be a little lower, and I wanted the curve to be a little less sharp of a curve. I wanted it to be more gradual. So I'm going to show you how I went ahead and changed my pattern to get this new curve that we marked when I tried it on her. So the first thing that I did was I just marked in my line darker with a Sharpie so that you could see it better, and also so that I would remember which line I wanted to follow, because I had a couple different lines that I had drawn on there when I was trying it on her, just to get an idea of which one we wanted. And this top line was the one that we wanted, so I marked it in a little darker. Next, I just need to seam rip this test run garment to take off just that one side of the front that we marked. So I'm just going to seam rip it at the shoulder, the back neck, as well as the side seam, just to pull off that front side. We only need to deal with that one front because that's the only side that we're going to need to make changes to. We don't need to do anything to the back. And we only need one side of the front because we only need one side to transfer our markings to the pattern. So once we have the front seam ripped off, I'm going to just cut this pattern, or rather this front piece, so that it looks the way that I want it to look before I transfer my markings to the pattern. So I'm just going to cut this bottom edge where it doesn't line up, and honestly this probably happened because I added that extra seam allowance where the dart already had seam allowance, but regardless, I fixed it here. So I cut this so that it lines up and smooths into that side seam. And then I'm just going to cut along the new princess seam that I want my piece to have. So we're just cutting it so that it looks the way we want it to, and then we're going to transfer what we have to pattern paper. Now that I have my two new and updated pattern pieces cut here in my fabric, I just need to transfer these pieces to pattern paper. So what I ended up doing, I have this pattern paper. It's actually exam room paper. You can get it on Amazon pretty cheap, and it's pretty thin, so it's kind of see-through. So what I did was I laid the pattern paper over the pieces, each piece, and then I traced around each piece so that I could get the basic shape of the piece that we had updated here onto pattern paper so that we can go from there. Alright, so now that I have my new pieces traced out, I'm just gonna go back over it with my rulers and just smooth out all the curves and everything on these pieces, just because they are looking a little bit ragged from tracing, and I just like to smooth everything out before I go on. And with everything smoothed out, now I just need to go back in and add in my seam allowance along the princess seam. And this is because I cut my fabric pieces apart at the princess seam, so I basically removed the seam allowance when I cut the pieces apart. Whereas on all the other edges, the shoulders and the side seams, I seam ripped the pieces apart, so the seam allowance was maintained on those other areas, but along the princess seam, because I cut the fabric, I need to go ahead and add in my seam allowance again. So that's what I'm doing here. Alright, so the first one of the front pieces is just about ready to cut out, and the last thing I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna grab the original, or the last iteration of the front pattern, and I'm just going to transfer over all of the notches and the other pattern markings that I want to maintain. So I'm just adding in the notches and stuff, and then I'm going to just cut this piece out and that one will be ready. And then we just need to add our seam allowance to the other front piece, transfer over those markings, and then we'll be done. Alright, so like I said, now I just need to add in my seam allowance along the princess seam of this side front piece, and then cut it out, transfer over my pattern markings and everything, and then we will be good to go. Alright, so that is all there is to it. Now this is my test run of the updated pattern, and do keep in mind that I made this vest to fit my mom and not me, so the vest doesn't really fit me perfectly, but I just wanted to be able to show you how it turned out after I updated the pattern, and I'm really happy with how it looks. I really like the princess seam in our second version here. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.